What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and at the time that I'm recording this video, Aubrey Plaza is rumored to be playing Mistress Death in Agatha All Along. I don't know if that's true. Do not take it as an absolute, but in case it is true, we're going to make a video. So most of you guys who are familiar with Mistress Death in some capacity know her as the one-time love interest of Thanos, although he's really been rebuked fairly consistently in recent years by her, as well as the one-time love interest of Deadpool if you've really followed his character closely. But there's actually a lot more to Mistress Death than meets the eye once you start digging into it. Now, one of the first things that I want to talk about here is the nature of Mistress Death in relation to other cosmic entities. The reason why is because Mistress Death is part and parcel to the form and function of the universe itself. She can die, and that is something that we'll talk about as we get further into this video. But in Quasar Volume 1, issue number 21 back in 1991, that's a lot of ones. It was established that Mistress Death was effectively a facsimile of the cosmic entity Oblivion. And it made sense because at that point in time in Marvel Comics, Oblivion was basically the representation of the absence of everything. So when the multiverse dies and there's nothing left in existence, Oblivion will continue to exist. And so if Oblivion is the antithesis of existence, it makes sense that Mistress Death would basically be an aspect of him and represent the antithesis to life. Now, your mileage may vary on how far you want to take that. It's completely up to you. But she, alongside all the other cosmic entities, basically came into existence when the universe was born. Now, that was established in Marvel's History of the Marvel Universe, Volume 2. And while that story sort of covered the history of the Marvel Universe in its entirety, from beginning to what will be this universe's eventual end, it also did establish the relationship of Mistress Death as far as other cosmic entities were concerned, that eternity and infinity were two sides of the same coin, representing time and space for the universe, literally the physical shape and the amount of time that passes between the birth of the universe and its eventual end. Master Order and Lord Chaos, of course, represent the opposing sides of order and chaos. So life as it exists in its current form in the universe is basically the result of these two individuals always consistently trying to seize control. But beyond this, the realm of Mistress Death is also particularly interesting because it's been depicted different ways in Marvel Comics. Now, one of the things that I want to do here before we get into that is I kind of want to sidetrack for a second, and I want to talk about the way that quote unquote the afterlife works in Marvel Comics. Because before the introduction of Mistress Death and Mephisto and all those different guys, all you had was Hela. That was originally established in the backup features to Journey into Mystery called Tales of Asgard, which was literally Jack Kirby just kind of building out the Asgardian mythos within Marvel Comics. And all we knew back then was just anybody who didn't die in honorable combat went to the realm of hell, which was ruled over by Hela. Despite how it sounds, it was not a place of torment, it was just the afterlife. And those individuals who did die in honorable combat, they went to Valhalla. But when Mistress Death was introduced, over time, Marvel began to build and expand on her realm. And there's a couple of really cool depictions of how her realm works in Marvel Comics. One of the most notable depictions came during Thanos Quest, which was basically the lead up to Infinity Gauntlet, quite literally the prequel to it. It explained how it was that Thanos assembled the Infinity Gauntlet in the first place. But in that storyline, there's a point where Thanos comes across something called the Infinity Well, which is literally this just giant water well within the castle of Mistress Death, which resides in just this desolate wasteland. And the Infinity Well will answer any question that you ask so long as you ask it correctly, which is how Thanos learned about the Infinity Gauntlet in the first place. But beyond that depiction of the realm of Mistress Death, there's also classic X-Men issue number 43, which basically dealt with Jean Grey's death in the aftermath of the Phoenix and the Dark Phoenix sagas. There comes a point when Jean Grey actually travels to essentially Mistress Death's realm, which seemingly was depicted as the White Hot Room. If you don't know what that means, it's not a great big huge thing. She ends up encountering a construction worker, and this construction worker is literally building these giant pillars. And I want to say that between the conversation that Jean Grey and Death had, that it was established that each one of these pillars was an afterlife for an individual who died. And so instead of the realm of death being this place where all these individuals who have passed on just sort of congregate and hang out at, instead, they all experience their own individual afterlife. Because of the realms of guys like Mephisto and other hell lords that exist out there, you can largely surmise that the realm of Mistress Death is probably a peaceful afterlife, as opposed to some place like Mephisto and his realm, which is a place of torment and suffering. But But outside of those two depictions, there aren't very many instances of Mistress Death's realm being revealed to us in such a way that it showed us anything that we didn't already know. And so again, kind of continuing on with her character, one of the things is that we don't know a lot about what she did before she came into contact with Thanos. And it kind of makes sense just because of the fact that with her first real comic book appearance taking place in Captain Marvel Volume 1, issue number 26, as a companion to Thanos, that she's just kind of been part and parcel to his character. And so what we found out in the Thanos Rising miniseries is that Thanos was visited by Mistress Death as a young girl when he was a young boy. Now, we weren't really told explicitly why it is that she seemed so interested in Thanos, but we can actually draw conclusions based on the context of stories that came after, Infinity Gauntlet and different things like that, which again, we'll talk about as we get further through this. But Mistress Death, being interested in Thanos, actually started goading him into committing murder. Now, it's not as though she forced his hand. If anything, it was really more the environment that Thanos was in that kind of led him down this path in the first place. And what I mean is that in Thanos' youth, because he was an Eternal that possessed the deviant gene, he physically looked different from all the other Eternals and was shunned by his peers. So he was basically a loner and an outsider. And so feeling so alone and feeling so outside of society, he just didn't really feel a part of it. He wanted to be, but he was just sort of rejected by everybody. And so it was a very easy process for Mistress Death to manipulate him in such a way that, number one, he took out the bullies that were always taunting and teasing him. And then after that, he just started killing indiscriminately. But the bigger point is that over time, Thanos began to develop quite literally a love for Mistress Death. Now, over the years in Marvel, that's kind of been played in different ways. Thanos is less in love with Mistress Death and more in love with just bringing harm to people, or Thanos is literally in love with Mistress Death. The latter is the one that you see most often, that he's always trying to gain her affection and her attention and different things along those lines. Eventually, there comes a point in the Thanos Rising miniseries where Mistress Death reveals her actual identity to Thanos. But what this seemed to do was start him on the path of legitimately becoming her romantic interest. Now, contextually, that came to a head in the Infinity Gauntlet miniseries by Jim Starlin, but following this sort of timeline for Mistress Death before we get to that, the next real major event that you saw her in was a story called Contest of Champions. Contest of Champions was a 3-part miniseries that was actually the first time that you saw a massive, effectively battle royale between all the various superheroes and the various supervillains within Marvel Comics, or at least the most popular ones. A lot of people attribute that to Secret Wars from 1984, but Contest of Champions predates that. This was really actually just a contest between the Grandmaster and Mistress Death. It was written in 1981 and came off the heels of the late 1970s story Korvac Saga, which basically saw Michael Korvac killing the Collector, who was one of the other Elders of the Universe. The whole idea was kind of a bid between Grandmaster and Mistress Death that if Grandmaster won, the Collector would be revived, which ultimately Grandmaster won, but it came as a kind of ruse on behalf of Mistress Death in the sense that the only way to bring the Collector back was to replace him with a soul of equal value. The Grandmaster ended up sacrificing himself, and then in Avengers Annual Issue number 16, you end up learning it was all a ruse on behalf of the Grandmaster, that what he wanted to do was pull the other Elders of the universe into the realm of Mistress Death, and then to be banished from the realm of Mistress Death. And in doing so, it would make them immortal, because they could never travel to her realm to die. And so that went into Silver Surfer Volume 3, issues 10 through 20. And what this did is it effectively told this story where the Elders of the universe had sought to destroy Galactus, believing that if they did, it could basically initiate a Big Bang. And in the same way that Galactus was a space explorer named Galen from the previous universe, born into this universe when that former universe collapsed, the Elders themselves would be born into the next universe, with each one being equal in power to Galactus. Such as it was, they were ultimately defeated by Mistress Death, but it wasn't really due to a conscious choice of hers. Instead, she was brought in by the In-Betweener and then forced to basically destroy these other members of the Elders of the universe. And so she essentially reversed the decree that they were no longer welcome in her realm and then took their lives. But the reason why I invoke Thanos in all of this is because the In-Betweener forcing Mistress Death to kill the Elders of the universe is what led to her allowing Thanos to use the Infinity Well and learn about the Infinity Gauntlet in the first place. That's what kicks off Thanos' quest. And that's why I say that contextually, what Mistress Death seemed to be looking for out of Thanos was actually a partner. And it's the reason why over the course of the Infinity Gauntlet story, she constantly rejected him. Because while he wiped out half the life in the universe and sent all those poor souls to her realm, at the end of the day, he was demonstrating a greater power than her own. She didn't want somebody better than her, and she didn't want somebody lesser than her. She wanted someone equal to her. And that more or less seemed to be the theme that Thanos just never really understood. And that seemed to be the reason why Mistress Death always rejected him every step of the way. Even now, that still happens in Marvel Comics, specifically in the Thanos Wins storyline from Donny Cates, where Thanos in the far-flung future finally encounters Mistress Death, and then ultimately Mistress Death walks away from him. But as far as the ideas of Mistress Death being able to die, this has actually happened a couple times, and don't worry, I'm not going to leave you guys hanging. We are going to talk about the whole Deadpool situation. So one of the cool things about Mistress Death is that as a cosmic entity, because she is part and parcel to the fabric of the universe itself, like anything else in the universe, she can be destroyed. The first real time this happened was in Secret Wars 2, of course a follow-up to the original Secret Wars from 1984. A little bit of context here, when Secret Wars 1984 happened, it initially introduced the Beyonder as this kind of being that existed out there. Dr. Doom stole his power and all kinds of crazy stuff happened. In the aftermath of Secret Wars, the Beyonder became curious about superheroes, specifically human life and things like that. And so Secret Wars 2 saw the Beyonder coming to Earth and basically dressing like John Travolta from Saturday Night Fever. I'm not even lying. He looked exactly like him. It was uncanny. But one of the things the Beyonder had done is that in an effort to basically make human life better, in the sense that people wouldn't have to worry about losing their loved ones or anything like that, the Beyonder basically destroyed Mistress Death. Now, of course, this was considered to be a kind of abhorrent action that Mistress Death was necessary, and so the Beyonder actually transformed his friend into the new Mistress Death. So the version you see running around right now is not the original, much in the same way that the living tribunal that you see now is actually Adam Warlock from an alternate reality. But the second time that we've seen Mistress Death die didn't actually happen in the main Marvel universe. Instead, it happened in a story called Thanos Imperative. And that was an alternate reality where the original Captain Marvel, Marvel of the Kree, instead of dying to cancer like he did in the main Marvel universe, he and all the other superheroes across the universe unified their power and destroyed Mistress Death in that reality. Now, of course, what ended up happening is it led to beings like Shumagorath, the many angled ones, basically influencing Doctor Strange and through him corrupting the rest of the universe and transforming that universe into a cancerverse, a place where people never die, but they're all basically demonic beings. And of course, Thanos Imperative saw the cancerverse invading the main Marvel universe. That universe was seemingly repelled or destroyed or wiped clean when Thanos brought Mistress Death from the main Marvel universe to the cancerverse, and then she basically killed all those people who were supposed to die. More recently, in a story called Annihilation Scourge, Marvel seems to have undone that, but because nobody ever really references it, Marvel never really talks about it, you can largely assume the original cancerverse has effectively been destroyed. Now, this is when you start to transition away from Mistress Death being this, for the most part, serious and almost kind of omnipresent force that exists out there, to the more comedic era of her storytelling in Marvel Comics. It is done over the course of several stories, but a lot of it was assembled in Deadpool in Death, written in 1998 by Joe Kelly. And all that really did was it pulled together a bunch of plot threads that had existed in Deadpool stories under Joe Kelly up to that point. And one of the first things it did is it focused on the origin of Deadpool and the first time he met Mistress Death, which is to say when he was initially being experimented on and the desire was to take Wolverine's healing factor and bond it to other people, Deadpool was going to die. But because of the nature of the nursery, right, where you had Ajax and those guys, so on and so forth, Killbrew, people who were effectively torturing and tormenting him, because of the fact that Mistress Death had approached him and he was able to see her, he was initially smitten with her. But when faced with the reality that him dying would mean that other people in that prison would be tortured, individuals that Deadpool was close to, he actually rejected Mistress Death and instead chose to stay alive. His healing factor kicked in that exact moment, and of course, Deadpool got his revenge on everybody in no uncertain terms. But that's what initially started the love triangle between Deadpool, Mistress Death, and Thanos. And not to make this sound too overly goofy, but you could literally envision this as Deadpool running towards something, Mistress Death chasing him, and Thanos chasing Mistress Death. But Mistress Death's romantic interest in Deadpool did not go unnoticed by Thanos. And in Deadpool Volume 3, issues 63 through 64, kind of known as the two-part Funeral for a Freak series, that Thanos basically cursed Deadpool Deadpool with immortality, so that he would never actually be allowed to travel to the realm of Mistress Death, and he'd never actually be able to be with her. I will also say there was the Walker storyline from Captain Marvel Volume 4, issues 17 and 18. Walker hasn't really been referenced since, but in effect, Walker was like a kind of death god from some other galaxy, and through him, Mistress Death learned what it meant to actually be in love. It did feel a little strange for Marvel to throw that story in there, especially considering the fact that she already understood what affection, love, different things like that already meant. And so by and large, for most Marvel comic fans and fans of Mistress Death, that's not really acknowledged very often. But then you went into the Avengers Celestial Quest 8-part miniseries. And all this really did is it gave us the first real instance in Marvel Comics of Mistress Death actually addressing Thanos and referring to her as essentially her lover, right? That she actually was in love with him. But the story itself largely dealt with something called the Rot, that during the original Thanos War storyline, when Thanos attained the Cosmic Cube and was ultimately defeated and turned to stone, that Thanos had actually died and traveled to the realm of Mistress Death, but effectively his energy merged with her energy and it gave birth to the Rot, which is just kind of living entropy. And so at the end of the story, Thanos ends up calling on essentially the power cosmic, and then using that alongside the powers of Mistress Death, they ultimately destroy the Rot itself. But after this, and really for a number of years, Mistress Death didn't really have a significant role in Marvel Comics. The closest that you got were things like Annihilation and Chaos War. And Annihilation was really confined more to Mistress Death believing that if Annihilus and his forces invading from the negative zone were successful in basically wiping out everything in existence, that it ultimately would lead to her having no real purpose and would potentially even be destroyed, which is actually something that was built on by Al Ewing in Jane Foster Valkyrie, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. But in Chaos War, she was one of the many cosmic entities that was annihilated by the Chaos King, Amatsu Mikabashi. But after this, you do go into a little bit of comedy with Deadpool and Thanos, specifically Deadpool and Thanos teaming up in order to save Mistress Death from Eternity. That Eternity had basically kidnapped Mistress Death after going insane, and no one in the universe could die. And Thanos, of course, loving death, didn't want to see that happen. And so after learning that Mistress Death had sought out Deadpool first, Thanos undid the curse he placed on Deadpool, then killed Deadpool, only to find out that Mistress Death wouldn't talk to him and would only talk to Deadpool. So Thanos had to resurrect him and bring him back to life. It was really just kind of an excuse for Marvel Comics to get rid of the old Joe Kelly plot thread of Deadpool effectively being immortal and being unable to die. But between the two of them, they're essentially able to save Mistress Death. But then you went into Jeff Lemire's Thanos Volume 2, which is arguably one of the coolest depictions of both Mistress Death and Thanos. And what you ended up getting here was the introduction of something called the God Quarry. But more so than that, it was actually a story that largely dealt with the relationship between Thanos and Thane, with Mistress Death kind of goading everything along. That in the eyes of Mistress Death, Thanos had kind of strayed from the path and become a very weak version of the character that she had initially fallen in love with, which in some ways was true and in some ways was untrue given the way his character had been written over the years. But the idea was that Thane was the biological son of Thanos. And in fact, that took place or was revealed during Jonathan Hickman's Avengers: A New Avengers run. And so Thane was given the power of the Phoenix Force, and then he was to basically wear Thanos down and ultimately destroy him. The intention of Mistress Death was to build Thanos back up into something greater. But what it did is it let Jeff Lemire use Thanos in such a way to where he could transition his character, remove him from his relationship with Mistress Death, which honestly had been a kind of decades-long will they won't they type situation, and Thanos walked away from Mistress Death entirely. And so following this, the way her character was written, Mistress Death, I wouldn't go so far as to say was aimless, more so than just kind of existing out there in the Marvel Universe. Now this goes into the Jane Foster Valkyrie comic, and more specifically, the most recent Thanos comic from Marvel. So in the Jane Foster Valkyrie series, one of the things that was established here, specifically in issue number 6, because the X-Men had created the Five, which were basically mutants that were capable of effectively working together and resurrecting dead mutants, that there was no need for Mistress Death when it came to the mutant population. And because the introduction of the Green Door in Al Ewing's Immortal Hulk run introduced the idea that anybody who had been exposed to gamma radiation would ultimately come back to life, that Hulks were effectively immortal, that also flew in the face of Mistress Death. And so the Death of Death was introduced as what was kind of, maybe, sort of, not really, not that well explained by Al Ewing a facsimile of the living tribunal. But in effect, it existed to judge whether or not death was necessary in this particular universe. That if death was deemed to be unnecessary, that death would be destroyed and this universe would become a cancerverse, which was kind of introduced as effectively what happens to a universe every time Mistress Death in that universe dies. Ultimately, it was decided that Mistress Death was necessary, that while the X-Men themselves had managed to basically overrule death and resurrect individuals from the afterlife, and the Green Door made it impossible for Hulks to die, it said nothing about all the other normal humans that exist out there. More so than that, Valkyrie alongside Doctor Strange actually pleaded this case that death is what gives life meaning, and it's what makes the relationships that we have with people around us so incredibly valuable and important. And so with that, Death of Death ultimately left and just allowed Mistress Death to stay alive. Now this takes us into the most recent Thanos run in Marvel Comics and the current state of Mistress Death, which is actually in the form of an Infinity Stone. So what ended up happening in the more recent Thanos series is that Mistress Death was visited in her realm by a woman named Christine Collins, and that Christine Collins' daughter had effectively passed away, and that Christine had visited Mistress Death for the purpose of trying to see if there was a way to bring her daughter back. Ultimately, it couldn't be done, but she was so fascinated by the emotional outpouring that Christine Collins had demonstrated in the loss of her daughter that Mistress Death chose to become mortal for a temporary amount of time. So she took over the body and really the existence of a girl named Roberta Marshall, and then wiped her own memories of her existence so that she would never remember who she actually was. And so what she ended up doing was actually working alongside the newest iteration of the Illuminati, which included Blue Marvel, and would provide them information for disasters that they could stop if they would basically help her wipe her memories of her own existence so she could experience true mortality and what it meant to really live as a normal human out there in the world. Thanos ended up figuring out what was going on. Thanos tracked her down to Fresno, California, and then basically woke her up to who she was. But because of the fact that Mistress Death had basically rejected Thanos in his entirety due to the fact that he had literally interrupted her entire experiment, there was a massive battle between the two of them. Thanos ended up overpowering Mistress Death and then turned her into the Death Stone, the Infinity Stone that's black that you guys see Thanos carrying around in the Infinity Watch comics that we haven't covered but we should cover. Now the concept of the afterlife is still there. Individuals can still die, and what actually happened over the course of Infinity Watch is that while Mistress Death was turned into the Death Stone, the other Infinity Stones actually started bonding themselves to other people. And so Thanos had effectively been traveling around capturing these individuals and trying to basically reform the Infinity Gauntlet. It sounds a lot cooler than it actually is. The story goes off the rails with a quickness, but if you're interested in me covering it, let me know. The story that we did where we talked about how the Incredible Hulk crushed Thanos, that was part of Infinity Watch. So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments section. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.